Congress has had a preoccupation with the budget deficit over the past few years. This focus has led to a series of fiscal crises, including program cuts, fiscal cliffs, government shutdowns, sequestration, debt ceiling crises, and fear of default on the nation's debt. It has slowed the nation's recovery from recession. Slow recovery is more than just an economic statistic. Too many people of all ages are unemployed or underemployed. An entire generation of young people has been facing worse job prospects than previous generations. People who should be getting established in life and starting families have found it very difficult to do so. This talk explores whether this preoccupation with debt and deficits is really necessary. It presents 7 important facts about America's deficits that can turn us away from fiscal crises and turn us back toward prosperity. These facts demonstrate that Congress has been focusing on the wrong deficit. You will see in a few minutes that the dangerous component of America's debt is caused by the trade deficit, not by the budget deficit. You will see that America's debt and its deficits do not need to be a barrier to prosperity and to giving our economy the amount of stimulus that it needs. This talk concludes with a preview of policies that can lead America back to prosperity. Fact number 1, America's national debt has 3 distinct components. All of America's national debt is divided in 3 parts. The largest component is money owed to federal trust funds, federal agencies, and the Federal Reserve. The government also owes money to individuals and organizations in the United States. The remaining 1/3 of the government's debt is money that we owe to foreign countries. The next 3 facts will focus on these 3 components of our debt and show that only one of them is a serious problem for the U.S. at the present time. Fact number 2, the money that the federal government owes to itself and to the Federal Reserve serves important economic purposes. This component of our national debt is money that we owe ourselves. The government is a debtor on our behalf, but the government and the Federal Reserve are also creditors on our behalf. About 2/3 of this money is owed to the Social Security Trust Fund and the trust funds for other government retirement systems. Federal law requires this money to be invested in Treasury securities. If you want to have a lot of money in the Social Security Trust Fund, then you want this component of the government's debt to be large. In addition, the Federal Reserve routinely creates new money to accommodate increases in the size of the economy. As the economy grows larger, the money supply needs to grow larger too. One of the best ways to pump that money into the economy is for the Federal Reserve to lend it to the government. The government then injects that money into the economy by keeping taxes below the level of spending. The more the economy grows, the more money needs to be created to accommodate that growth. A nation can accumulate this sort of debt and deficit for 1,000 years without any ill effects. The Federal Reserve also creates money to stimulate the economy. This is a good thing in the same way that being in the hospital is a good thing. Being in the hospital is a combination of bad news and good news. It is bad news that you are sick, but it is good news that you are getting treatment that can keep you alive until your disease is cured. Likewise, it is very bad news that our economy needs a lot of artificial stimulus. We need stimulus because of a recession, and because of recent malfunctions of our financial system, and especially because of our trade deficit. We are in a pretty bad situation, but it would be a mistake to blame our problems on the medicine while ignoring the disease that makes the medicine necessary. That is what Congress does when it objects to the amount of economic stimulus our nation is receiving, while it ignores the loss of factories and the trade deficit which make that stimulus necessary. So the money that the government owes to itself or to the Federal Reserve is actually good for our economy. It does not justify fiscal cliffs and sequestration and all the rest of the unnecessary fiscal crises we have had over the past few years. Fact number 3 is very surprising to most people. America's domestic debt is at a normal level. When people think about our national debt, they often think in terms like exploding or skyrocketing or unsustainable. But those terms do not apply to the debt that is held by American investors and institutions. The most important thing to know about this component of debt is that it is not growing out of control. In fact, this component is about equal to its 29-year average relative to gross domestic product. It tends to go up when the budget deficit goes up, and then it tends to go back down when the budget deficit goes down. This debt also serves some important purposes. It is good for pension funds and insurance companies and other investors to diversify their investments with Treasury securities. Some countries do get into trouble by having too much domestic debt, but this component is currently at a reasonable and sustainable level for the U.S. So domestic debt does not justify debt ceiling showdowns and government shutdowns and all the rest of the unnecessary fiscal crises that have held back our economy over the past few years. That brings us to the debt that America owes to foreign countries. Fact number 4, America's foreign debt is an extremely serious problem. This is the component of our debt that is skyrocketing. This is the component that is unsustainable. This is the debt that will be a burden to our children and grandchildren. This is the debt that will eventually lead to economic disaster. Someday, our trading partners will refuse to lend us more money unless we adopt policies that promote their interests at the expense of our own. That sort of situation brought disaster upon Greece and Spain in recent years, and someday it is likely to bring disaster upon the United States. So all of the anxiety about America's debt is justified, but it should be focused on our foreign debt, not on the money that the government owes to itself or the money that it owes to Americans and American institutions. That brings us to fact number 5. Our foreign debt is caused by our trade deficit, not by our budget deficit. This is the most important of the 7 facts presented in this talk. We will start with the same red line as before, representing our foreign debt, and then add a blue line to show how our trade deficit has accumulated since 1976. Now you can mostly see just the blue line. The 2 lines are almost identical, so the blue line almost completely covers up the red line. That sure makes it look like the trade deficit causes our foreign debt. But economists know that correlation does not prove causation. So this chart by itself does not actually prove that the trade deficit causes our foreign debt. It is the definition of national income that establishes a causal relationship between the trade deficit and foreign debt. National income is defined as national spending minus the trade deficit. In other words, a nation's income will always fall short of its spending by the amount of its trade deficit. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is not just a theory or a tendency. This is a definition. So a perfect measure of the trade deficit will always be exactly equal to a perfect and complete measure of the amount by which a nation's income falls short of its spending. Even the imperfect and incomplete measures in this chart are almost exactly equal. Now, if our foreign debt is driven by the trade deficit, that means it is not driven by the federal budget deficit. For example, when we had a budget surplus during the Clinton administration, our foreign debt rose in lockstep with the trade deficit. When we had a large budget deficit during the Bush administration, our foreign debt rose in lockstep with the trade deficit. When we had an even larger budget deficit during the Obama administration, our foreign debt still rose in lockstep with the trade deficit. Whether the government is short of funds or not, we still need to borrow the money we spend on imports back from our trading partners. If we failed to do this, then our trading partners would do something worse with that money, like buying control of more of our corporations. This means that Congress has been focusing on the wrong deficit. Instead of focusing so much on the budget deficit, Congress should be focusing on the trade deficit. That is why the primary focus of my economic policy is bringing factories back to America. That is what it will take to close our trade deficit and reduce our foreign debt. Most politicians will tell you that their number one economic priority is restoring prosperity. I care as much about prosperity as anyone else, and I have a good plan for bringing prosperity back. But bringing back factories is even more important. Bringing back factories is a national security issue and an issue of economic survival, as well as being a jobs issue and a debt issue. We have now looked at all three components of America's national debt without finding any justification for the fiscal crises of the past few years, and without finding any reason for debt to prevent our economy from getting the amount of stimulus that it needs. And we still have two important facts to go. Fact number 6, the level of government spending has been fairly stable since 1980 relative to gross domestic product. This is another fact that surprises most people. When people see America's debt grow, they often assume this must be caused by increases in government spending. But total government spending, federal, state, and local combined, has been pretty steady over the past 33 years relative to GDP. Spending does go up relative to GDP during recessions. This is partly caused by safety net expenditures and bailout expenditures and spending intended to stimulate the economy. Sometimes a bigger factor is that GDP goes down in a recession, so spending would be a higher percentage of GDP even if the number of dollars spent stayed the same. Spending then goes back down relative to GDP during recoveries. That is what started to happen in 2010, and by 2013, government spending was getting back toward a normal percentage of GDP. I want to make it clear that I am not implying that Congress should stop trying to budget federal spending in a prudent manner. That is one of its most important responsibilities. We should continue to seek out spending that is not justified and to look for low priority spending that should be cut to make room for higher priorities. As we do that, however, we should remember that our current spending level is actually in line with levels over the past 30 years. Our fiscal crises cannot be justified by an explosion of government spending because there is no explosion of government spending. Fact number 7, all of the major increases in our budget deficit have occurred during recessions, and those deficits have been followed by economic recoveries. The blue columns at the top of the chart show decreases in the federal budget deficit since 1957. The red columns at the bottom show increases in the budget deficit. The black graph shows an economic indicator based on employment levels. Each recession looks like a finger pointing downwards. A few of these fingers represent mini recessions, where employment receded for a short time, but then recovered without leading to a full-blown recession. What I want you to notice is that each of those fingers pointing downwards is pointing directly toward an increase in the budget deficit. Every major increase in the deficit occurred during a recession or a mini recession, and every recession brought an increase in the deficit. Deficits are increased by recessions. Likewise, every recovery has occurred after a major increase in the deficit, and every recovery has led to decreases in the deficit. These patterns are more than coincidence. Budget deficits are what economists call an automatic stabilizer. Deficits happen automatically during a recession because revenues go down, but most spending tends to stay about the same, and safety net expenditures go up. Those deficits stabilize the economy by nudging it back toward prosperity. A deficit means that the government is taking less money out of the economy with taxes than it is pumping in with spending, and that helps the economy expand. On the other hand, spending cuts and tax increases tend to contract the economy and postpone the recovery that is needed to resolve the budget deficit. I want to make it clear that I am not suggesting that the government should spend money for the sole purpose of stimulating the economy. That is where a lot of corporate welfare and dubious pork barrel spending come from. I am talking about keeping spending at a normal and prudent level, while we intentionally keep tax revenues below the amount being spent. It would be bad economics to cut high-priority spending in an effort to balance the budget while we are still trying to recover from a recession. Thus, the historical record and economic theory and common sense all tell us that recessions cause deficits, and that deficits play an important role in restoring prosperity. Prosperity is what has always cured our deficits, not tax increases and spending cuts that delay recovery by contracting the economy. Two conclusions emerge when we put all 7 facts together. First, the fiscal crises that our nation endured in recent years were unnecessary. And second, America's debt should not be a barrier to giving our economy the amount of stimulus that it needs. The dangerous portion of America's debt is driven by the trade deficit, not the budget deficit, and the economy is nudged back toward prosperity when taxes are kept below the level of spending. That does not mean that we can stimulate our economy without limit. There is a limit on economic stimulus, and that limit is inflation. Therefore, the next talk in the series will present some important facts about inflation. It will show that the key to restoring prosperity is finding a better way to control inflation. The third talk in the series will lay out a path to prosperity. I call my approach safe stimulus. We need to stimulate the economy, but we need to do it without excessive debt or excessive inflation. I will propose a small improvement in the way we create money and a large improvement in the way we control inflation. These changes will make it safer to use the traditional techniques for stimulating the economy. In particular, we can safely reverse some of the spending cuts that have been made through sequestration. We can safely continue the sort of money creation we have had in recent years. We might even be able to restore the temporary cut to the Social Security tax that was repealed in 2013. The changes I propose will make it possible to do those things without driving the government deeper into debt and without fear of inflation getting out of hand. My strategy of safe stimulus will also have some good secondary effects, such as improving the solvency of the Social Security system, reducing recessionary downturns in the auto industry and the housing industry, and softening Michigan's recessions when recessions do occur. If those are results you would like to see, you can learn more on the dargaforcongress.com website, and my plan will be spelled out more fully by the next 2 talks in this series.